Excuse me. Well, you can see on the screens there the same graphic we used a couple of weeks ago. Just to help you with the timeline, I will point out to you that we have Daniel right down here. So approximately what is the date? What's the time that we're talking about here, roughly? Around 600 to 500, 600 down to 500 BC. And it helps me, as I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, it helps me to think that way because I like to think in terms of the timeline so I can keep people kind of lined up. So if I were to ask you, was Moses before or after Daniel, what would you say? He was way before, yeah. And was Abraham before Moses or after Moses? Well, he's before. And so when you think about it like that, it kind of helps you line things up. And so when someone mentions a person, then you know where we are in the whole of the story. And so when someone mentions to you Daniel, you know that we're talking about the time of Babylonian captivity, which is after the United Kingdom. And so you can put all that together. I like the timeline. It's always been helpful to me. Another thing I like is having maps. I've always been appreciative of maps. So I'll show you this. Babylon and Chaldea right over here. You can see that, and then slide just west, and that's where you'll find Jerusalem. Now, it may be helpful if we kind of zoom in on that. You can see that a little bit better. So that's where we are geographically, generally speaking. And maybe that's helpful to you as well to kind of understand where things are taking place. So, yes, sir.
Really interesting when Larry and I talked about this after services. Is on that map.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Abraham came from.
Yep.
It makes this big sweeping loop to go around the desert that's, if you took a straight shot. It's kind of interesting that as far as the children of Israel go, that Abraham kind of has his roots in this part.
It's kind of fascinating to me how his story, the promise, the person to whom the promise was made begins there, is people end up there as the promise is working itself out. All of that's kind of connected. And when you sit back and look at what God has done, we say from time to time that everything he's doing is intentional, but he's never just doing one thing at a time. He's always working out ultimately his grand plan for the benefit of humanity. And it's awesome to think about all of that. When you get to the end of chapter 1, you're left with Daniel and his three friends have made an arrangement with the guy that's over them. The arrangement is working out pretty well, it appears. And so Daniel and his friends have kind of settled into a pretty good spot. Is that fair? They're in a kind of a routine, okay? A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned to you that one of the things I wanted us to discuss before we left chapter 1 was this business of Daniel and his friends becoming servants of Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar's government. Daniel was a Jew. Nebuchadnezzar was not a Jew. Daniel believed in God. Nebuchadnezzar, at this point especially, not so much. Daniel's trying to do God's will. His concern about eating the king's food centered around what?
Defile him if he ate.
It would defile him. And what does that mean? What does he mean when he says, I don't want to defile myself by eating this food? What does he mean? What's he talking about? Clean and unclean. Yeah, Jewish law. Some of that stuff I can't eat by Jewish law. And so Daniel's coming at all of this from a totally different perspective, and yet he finds himself serving Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar's government. And I really find that interesting because on the one hand, I wonder if I would tend to say, well, I'm not serving that guy. I mean, he's just evil, as if I have no evil in me at all. I've never done anything evil. But he's just bad. He's totally, completely bad, and I'm not going to have anything to do with him. I'm not going to do what he tells me to do. I'm not going to serve him. Why didn't Daniel have that attitude? I mean, this guy has come in and pretty well destroyed, or is in the process of destroying, Jerusalem. The city walls are going to have to be rebuilt 70 years from now because this siege is tearing them down. He has taken things out of the temple, God's things. He and his government are not good. So how is it that Daniel goes along with all of this and serves him? What do you make of that, and how do you draw conclusions about that? We've talked about God using bad people in bad situations to bring about His will. Yes. We've talked about how God uses people generally, right? Sometimes we get really hung up on who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Sometimes I really want to deal with that and try to identify that. And if I perceive you to be the good guy, then I'm on your team. Because why? What's my logic? I'm a good guy too, right? So if I'm a good guy in my mind, then I want to be with all the good people. And Nebuchadnezzar's not one of the good guys, and so I don't want to be with him. When really, we're all the same. The difference between them is Daniel's striving to please God and Nebuchadnezzar isn't at this moment. But God is interested in Nebuchadnezzar. And God is interested in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, his government. And Daniel, at a very young age, seems to have enough sense to understand all of that. Daniel's been taken from his home, from his place, from his family, and he's in Babylon now. And while he's in Babylon, he's going to do the very best he can in serving the one he's supposed to serve. His circumstance, his lot in life. You might make a little connection between what's going on here and what the Apostle Paul says to Christians in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there's a lot of instruction going on. A lot of it has to do with marriage, a lot of it has to do with relationships, but one of the relationships that Paul mentions there to the Corinthians is, if you find yourself in a serving role in life and you become a Christian, what do? You keep serving as a Christian. That's what you do. You be the best you can be. You don't say, well, I'm one of the good guys now, so I am going to rebel against all the people I perceive to be not good. That's not it. That's not what Paul says. He says the opposite of that. In fact, he specifically says, don't get confused about this. When you become a Christian, you remain in that circumstance that you're in and you live your life the best you can that way. Excuse me. It seems to me that that's what we have here with Daniel. Now, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that are interesting about it. We don't perceive ourselves to be servants or slaves very often, do we? That's just not how we think of ourselves. Daniel was most definitely a slave or a servant, yes? For the enemy, yes? And yet he's going to do the very best he can do. Is God with him in this? Absolutely. Does that say God approves of the circumstance?
Well, in this instance, yes.
Yes. How do we know that? How do we know that beyond Daniel?
Because he set it up.
Yeah, God arranged all of this. God brought all of this about. How does Daniel know it? That's a bit of a trick question. How does Daniel know that he's supposed to serve Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar's government? How does he know that? Well, there's two answers to that. One is, I'm not sure how he knows that. And the other one is, maybe God told him, I don't know. But what you see is God being with him. And you see God saying to him, you do your best, I take care of you. I'll be with you. Yes, sir.
Now, it's possible that he's heard the prophecies from the Isaiahs of the world.
Yeah.
He knows that this is providentially arranged. And he may put two and two together and say, because God has providentially arranged that first the Assyrians were taking the northern kingdom, and now that we would be taken captive by the Chaldeans. If God's arranged it, I'm going to make the best of it.
I need to do my part. He is also a prophet. True? He is becoming a prophet and probably gains more and more insight as time goes on, but there's more to it that we want to get to. Yes, sir.
You know, this is not unique to Daniel. We have Joseph, we've had Esther, Mordecai.
Yes, sir.
Did this for the benefit of the nation, too. Particularly Esther and Mordecai.
It just requires them to look beyond themselves and their circumstance. It requires Daniel and everybody else in those situations to say, wait a minute, I don't want to be in this position. I don't want to be in this role, but this is the role I'm in. This is where, if you'll allow it, God has put me. It's the bloom where you're planted concept. It's that this is where I am now, and therefore I am obligated to do the very best I can here in this situation, even though I don't like this situation. That's a hard one for us. We are not where Daniel is. But let me ask you this, do you ever find yourself not liking the obligations you have, whatever they may be right now in your life? You ever find yourself not liking them? Sometimes we get like that. Sometimes the circumstances aren't good and therefore we don't like them. The end result is we are where we are. Just the way that is. And our job is to do the very best we can to glorify God in that situation right where we are. We're going to go over to Romans chapter 6. Leno, you got anything you want to say? No? Okay. Turn over to Romans 6 with me. In Romans 6, you have a discussion kind of in the middle of the chapter about being a slave. Remember that? Verse 8. Now, if we have died with Christ, he's saying we have. So since we've died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, is never to die again. Death no longer is master over him. For the death that he died to sin once for all, but the life that he lives to God. It kind of reminds us of Paul's statement in Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. It's the same concept that Paul is saying here. But he's talking about how Christ did it here. And then verse 11, even so consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. So that's where we are. We're dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Now the result of that is where he goes next. The so what of that is where he goes next. And that is what I want us to talk about in view of Daniel and where he is. So beginning in verse 12, he says, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies. Verse 14, sin shall not be master over you. And then verse 15, shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? No. Well, why not? Why can't we just go ahead and sin because God's grace will fix it? Look at verse 16. Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed, and having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. We look at Daniel and we see him as a slave, a Jew in Babylon. And he's going to have to do whatever Nebuchadnezzar tells him to do, within limits. Daniel puts some limits on it. We'll read through those stories. But he is a slave, and there is no doubt about it. And he is in that situation and doesn't want to be there, and he makes the very best of it. Question, are you and I slaves? Of whom? Of our Lord. Slaves to righteousness, slaves of righteousness, slaves to God. Let me ask you this. Do we complain about that? Do we get put out with the obligations attached to that? Do we sometimes say, well, I don't like all of that. I don't like the expectation that God, the church, his people, whatever, have of me. I don't like the situation. You're demanding too much of me. Do we sometimes have that attitude? That, you know, I want to be a Christian, but I want to be a Christian and I want y'all to just leave me alone. Just let me do my thing. Don't bother me. Do we have that attitude sometimes? Are we tempted to have that attitude? Or do we see ourselves as slaves to righteousness, like Daniel and his three friends, who basically said, I'm here to do the best I can, whether I like it or not? We are right where we want to be in Christianity, in Christ. We're right where we want to be. We decided and chose to be where we are, right? We each, if you're a Christian, you made the decision, that's what I want to be, that's the thing to which I want to be obligated, that's where I want to be, right? We made that decision. Daniel didn't make the decision to be in Babylon. That wasn't his call. Where we are as slaves to righteousness is something we have chosen. And yet sometimes we complain about it. We complain about the work we have to do. We complain about the other people we have to do it with. We complain about all the circumstances surrounding it. I just wonder if maybe we could look at Daniel and his three friends, those young men who have no benefit of parental guidance at this point, probably not much contact with others that we would consider to be authority figures in their lives anymore. They're just there. Young men doing the best they can do in that situation that they don't want to be in. And I am here in a situation I have chosen to be in, a situation that is incredibly blessed. And sometimes I'm just not happy about the circumstances. Isn't that interesting? Verse 19 of Romans 6. He says, I'm speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, resulting in further lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, resulting in sanctification. Here's an interesting point he makes right there. He says, you know, there are some things you enjoy doing that you shouldn't do. And those things further enslave you to godlessness. Those things destroy you. Those things set you on a path that leads to a place you really don't want to go. Those things, though, you like doing. And he's trying to get Christians to stop thinking about what do I want to do? What do I enjoy? What kind of life do I want to arrange for myself? And to get us to think about what does the king need in his kingdom? What is it that I can do in the kingdom today? How can I serve as his slave today? What can I do? And so what I'd like for us to do for a while now is when we think about Daniel and his three friends, we'll read about some stories that they're going to be involved in. When we think about them, let's think about Romans 6 and the fact that we've chosen to be slaves to God. So there should be no complaining about that. We've chosen to be slaves to God who loves us and does what's best for us. So there should be no complaining about that. We have chosen the blessed circumstance we're in, and there should be no complaining about that. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? Well, you got to say yes or no. Anybody want to think that? Do you think that's not reasonable? Is it not reasonable, Paul? Is it fair? Because maybe you don't struggle with it, but sometimes I get a little whiny about circumstances that I want and that I know bless me and the ones I love. But there's some components about it that aren't always easy. And so there comes the attitude. We just don't see that with Daniel. So let's go back over there. Let's go back over to Daniel. Verse 18, at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Daniel becomes an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. At this point, a very wicked man. God has arranged it now so Nebuchadnezzar can be to some degree, somehow, sometimes influenced by a God-fearing young man. Or really 4 of them. God arranged that. And the thing I wonder about regarding that is If my position is, well, I can't get involved in such and such because there are bad people involved in that, and I can't somehow try to influence this situation because there's bad people involved in that. If I take that position, what I'm going to effectively do is absolutely nothing for the kingdom. That's what I'll end up doing. Nothing for the kingdom. I won't try to reach anybody. I won't try to be an influence. I won't try to grow and understand someone else's position and how they got where they are to maybe try to help or maybe even see in them some things I could learn from. What Daniel is doing is what God wanted him to do. And now God has arranged it where Nebuchadnezzar, at this time one of the most powerful men on earth, has access to truth, has access to righteousness. And that is going to, at some point, pay off a little bit. Somehow. We'll see that in the story. Okay. Anything about that in chapter 1 that you want to point out? Yes, sir.
That business of whether we're going to be slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness, Todd, I think sometimes it's one of those underlying discussions that perhaps we miss when we look at passages like Luke 14:25, the business of evaluating the cost of becoming a member of the kingdom or becoming a disciple of the Savior. There's some things I'm going to have to give up. Yes, there's some things that I've got to do, but I think sometimes we don't go into enough depth about how life-changing the business of leaving all to follow Christ is, and this being slaves to sin is one of those things we've got to leave.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's hard for us sometimes to let settle in the break that the new life must have with the old life or from the old life. It's hard for us to get this put to death concept. He talks about in Romans 6, talks about in Galatians 2:20, as we said, the idea that the old person that I was doesn't exist anymore, so I can't go back to that. I can't dabble in that. I can't think that way because that way doesn't exist anymore for my life. We're not really good at that. What most of us try to do is we try to generally move away from the old life toward the new life, but there's some things about the old life we kind of enjoy, we're going to hang on to just a little bit, and we don't cleanly cut those ties. Here's why that's a challenge, though. Relationships make that really challenging. And Daniel's a good example of that. Daniel is about to be lumped in chapter 2 with the wise men, the conjurers, and the magicians, right? That's who he's going to be lumped in with. Is he that? He is not that at all. He's a prophet of God. But in their society and in that government, he is going to be lumped in with those guys. It's hard for us to maintain those relationships like he and the others are doing and still have that I won't be defiled by the king's food mentality. It's hard. It is a challenge. And sometimes we state it too simply. Well, you just change everything all at once. You just change. That would be really nice. But it doesn't really work that way because of relationships and associations. That means we have to work really hard at becoming the new person while we realize that we have an obligation to everybody we knew as the old person too. It's not easy, but Daniel provides a really good example. And then, of course, Jesus, better than any, provided that example. Did the Pharisees give Jesus a hard time because of who he ate with from time to time? Yeah. Yeah, they did. They made all sorts of mean statements about him and said things that weren't true. His attitude was, it's not those who are well who need a physician, but those who are sick. I understand we can go too far with that. I understand that we're not Jesus. But also understand that he expects his people to be in the world and affecting the world. And that's what Daniel's doing. And Daniel's doing it by God's authority, with God's direction, and in ways that they're just amazing. There he is, consulting the king, advising the king. And as we'll see in chapter 2, the king is not always doing what's right. The king does not always have the right attitude. I've always been struck with Nebuchadnezzar. We are introduced to him really in chapter 2, his personality in chapter 2. And, he brings in his wise men to tell him his dream. And he says to them, you tell me what my dream was and what it means. And of course, what do they say?
You take care of the first part.
Yeah, you tell us your dream and then we'll tell you what it means. Which, that's what I'd say if I were them, because I have no idea what his dream is and no idea what his dream meant. So I understand it, and apparently so did he. But we get a look at his personality in verse 5. Right off the bat, in verse 5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. That's Nebuchadnezzar. It's not the last time he's going to say something like that. That's the king. You do it the way I want it done or I'll kill you and everybody around you. That's what's going to happen. That's the guy Daniel has gotten close to. That's the guy God wanted Daniel and his 3 friends to be able to influence. That's also the guy that I would have said, I don't have anything to do with him. I don't want to be near him. I don't want to serve him. I don't want to be around him at all. And that just wouldn't be right. So we need to kind of have a more mature attitude about how we deal with people, understanding, first of all, that there's not a one of us who is wholly righteous. If we are righteous to any degree, we are righteous based on the grace of God. It is just that way. And when Paul is drawing that contrast in Romans chapter 6 between righteousness and unrighteousness, he's not talking about those who are perfect and those who are not perfect. He's talking about those who are pursuing God's righteousness and those who are not. We are those who are pursuing God's righteousness. But let's not get to thinking that makes us righteous and better than somebody else. It does not. It will not. Comments, questions, anything you want to say? Okay. Back in chapter 2 then. After Nebuchadnezzar says, you tell me what I dreamed and what it means, they say, no, it doesn't work that way. Then verse 5, and then they say, verse 7, a second time, well, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare its interpretation. And then this is where things get really interesting to me, because Nebuchadnezzar knows what's going on. And if you know what's going on, then why do you have the wise men and the conjurers and the magicians? If you understand how they're operating, why do you have them in the first place? Why do you use them? Why are they there? I've never understood that. So they say in verse 7, you tell me the dream. Verse 8, the king said, I know for certain that you're bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. He says, I know you're scrambling. I understand what's happening here. Verse 9, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there's only one decree for you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. Sounds to me like he doesn't believe they can declare to him its interpretation or the dream, either one. He's not fully convinced. He knows what they're doing. And they're doing what they're doing because they can't tell him what he wants to know. And so why would we have them in the first place? Well, their society had those built in, I guess you'd say. That was just a part of it. And more than likely, he inherited a lot of these when he became king. And that's just the way we roll. And it works fine most of the time, except when the king is really distressed personally in his heart and mind, when he really wants an answer. Where'd the dream come from? God. Why did he have the dream? Really? Yeah, because God wanted some things revealed, and because God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to understand who was in charge. He wanted Nebuchadnezzar to see what was really going on. And so what we're getting here in chapter 2 is the very beginning of the king of Babylon, for the first time probably ever, realizing that he's not as great as he thought he was. And he can command and threaten all day long, but that doesn't mean he's going to get an answer to his question. He'll get an answer to his question if God chooses to give him an answer to his question. And this is the beginning of the humbling, although it's hard to see here, of Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, sir?
Yeah, a lot of the folks thought there were gods in particular regions. It was the God who
Very good. And he's going to get more of that later on, a lot more of that, in fact. But he's kind of waking up a little bit, it appears, to what's really going on in his kingdom and how useless it is for someone to say, I'm a magician. He's figuring all of that out. The Chaldeans in verse 10 answer him back. Now they're still buying time here, and he knows it. They answer back, and what do they say in verse 10? It can't be done. Which would have caused you to say what? Then why are you here? What are you doing? If you can't do what I need you to do, if you're a magician who can't perform magic, if you're a wise man who can't tell me wisdom, yeah. And so what's he going to do? We're going to dispose of them. We're going to kill them all. You're not serving the purpose, and so we're going to get rid of you. Verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king commands is difficult, and there's no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Isn't it fascinating that every now and then the magicians and conjurers of another country say something that's true? Can you give me another example? Acts 17. All right, very good, very good. Give me another. Give me an Old Testament example. Prior to this, maybe around 1450 BC-ish, Pharaoh's magicians say what? That's the finger of God. We can't do that. We've been dabbling in magic. We've been fiddling around and tricking people. But that, nope, God did that. Sometimes, because of the circumstances God creates, those who are fake will actually tell the truth. And here in verse 11, they told the truth. It is God who can do it, and only that. Verse 12, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon, including Daniel and his 3 friends. But then God was with Daniel. And so this is one of those things. I want you to think about it like we would look at it with Elijah and then Elisha when they're confronted with really tough situations. Think about Elijah up on Mount Carmel and how he's got this showdown going on with the 450 prophets of Baal, and all of that is set up, and Elijah he must rely on the Lord. He must work with God, and he must trust that God is going to do something. Because Elijah's up there on the mountain, and he's up there with everybody else, and he has to trust that God's going to provide, whatever it is. And God does provide. That's where Daniel is. He has to trust that God's going to provide. That may be one of the biggest challenges we face today, is trusting that God will take care of things. Do we believe He can? So yes, we do believe He can. Do we believe He will in every circumstance? We believe He will in every circumstance do what He knows is best. That will not always be what I want. But I still have to trust that He is still God, and He is still involved, and He is still doing what He knows is best. It is such a challenge for us to do that. Daniel helps us kind of firm up our resolve. That was the second bell, right? Okay, we're not going to do what we did a couple of weeks ago and go on for another 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to finish up here. We'll talk a little bit more, Lord willing, next week, beginning with verse 14 of chapter 2, and then we'll pick up some speed and move through it. Thanks very much for participating.